Capital, Volume 1. This independent recording by Andrew S. Reitenberg is public domain, both in content and in audio. Chapter 21. Peace Wages. The peace wage is nothing but a converted form of the time wage, just as the time wage is a converted form of the value or price of labor power. In peace wages, it seems at first sight as if the use value bought from the worker is not his labor power as it actually functions, living labor, but labor already objectified in the product. It would also seem as if the price of this labor is determined not, as with the time wages, by the fraction daily value of labor power over a working day of a given number of hours, but by the producer's capacity for work. The confidence that trusts in this, the mere appearance of things, ought to receive an initial severe shock from the fact that both forms of wages exist side by side at the same time in the same branches of industry. For example, the compositors of London, as a general rule, work by the piece, time work being the exception, while those in the country work by the day, the exception being work by the piece. The shipwrights of the Port of London work by the job or piece, while those of all other ports work by the day. In the same saddlery shops of London, often for the same work, piece wages are paid to Frenchmen and time wages are paid to Englishmen. In the actual factories, where piece wages are the general rule, certain specific operations have to be excepted from this form of valuation on technical grounds, and they are therefore paid by time wages. However, it is in itself obvious that the difference of form in the payment of wages in no way alters their essential nature, although the one form may be more favorable to the development of capitalist production than the other. Let the ordinary working day contain 12 hours, of which 6 are paid, 6 unpaid. Let its value product be 6 shillings. The value product of 1 hour of labor will therefore be sixpence. Let us suppose that, as a result of experience, a worker working with the average amount of intensity and skill, and therefore devoting to the production of an article only the amount of labor time socially necessary, produces, in the course of 12 hours, 24 pieces, either distinct products or measurable parts of some integral construction. The value of these 24 pieces, after we have subtracted the amount of constant capital contained in them, will be 6 shillings. The value of a single piece will be 3 pence. The worker receives 1.5 pence per piece, and thus earns 3 shillings in 12 hours. Just as, with time wages, it does not matter whether we assume that the worker works 6 hours for himself and 6 hours for the capitalist, or every half hour for himself and the other half for the capitalist, so here it does not matter whether we say that each individual piece is half paid for and half unpaid for, or that the price of only 12 of the pieces is the equivalent of the value of the labor power, while in the other 12 pieces surplus value is incorporated. The form of piece wages is just as irrational as that of time wages. While in our example, 2 pieces of a commodity, after subtraction of the value of the means of production consumed in them, are worth 6 pence as the product of 1 hour of labor, the worker receives for them a price of 3 pence. Peace wages are not in fact a direct expression of any relation of value. It is not, therefore, a question of measuring the value of the piece by the labor time incorporated in it. It is rather the reverse. The labor the worker has expended must be measured by the number of pieces he has produced. In time wages, the labor is measured by its immediate duration. In peace wages, by the quantity of products in which the labor has become embodied during a given time. The price of labor time itself is finally determined by this equation. The value of a day of labor is equal to the daily value of labor power. The piece wage is therefore only a modified form of the time wage. Let us now look a little more closely at the characteristic peculiarities of piece wages. The quality of the labor is here controlled by the work itself, which must be of good average quality if the piece price is to be paid in full. Piece wages become, from this point of view, the most fruitful source of reductions in wages, and of frauds committed by the capitalists. This is because they provide an exact measure of the intensity of labor. Only the labor time which is embodied in a quantity of commodities laid down in advance and fixed by experience counts as socially necessary labor time, and is paid as such. In the larger workshops of the London tailors, therefore, a certain piece of work, a waistcoat for instance, is called an hour, or half an hour, the hour being valued at 6 pence. Practice determines the size of the average product of 1 hour. With new fashions, repairs, etc., a contest arises between the employer and the worker, as to whether a particular piece of work is 1 hour, and so on, until here also experience decides. Similarly so in the London furniture workshops, etc. If the worker cannot provide labor of an average degree of efficiency, and if he cannot therefore supply a certain minimum of work per day, he is dismissed. Since the quality and intensity of the work are here controlled by the very form of the wage, superintendence of labor becomes to a great extent superfluous. Piece wages therefore form the basis for the modern domestic labor as we described earlier, as well as for a hierarchically organized system of exploitation and oppression. The latter has two fundamental forms. On the one hand, piece wages make it easier for parasites to interpose themselves between the capitalist and the wage labor, thus giving rise to the subletting of labor. The profits of these middlemen come entirely from the difference between the price of labor which the capitalist pays and the part of that price they actually allow the worker to receive. In England, this system is called, characteristically, the sweating system. On the other hand, piece wages allow the capitalist to make a contract for so much per piece with the most important worker. In manufacture, with the chief of some group, in mines with the extractor of the coal, in the factory with the actual machine worker, at a price for which this man himself undertakes the enlisting and the payment of his assistants. Here the exploitation of the worker by capital takes place through the medium of the exploitation of one worker by another. Given the system of piece wages, it is naturally in the personal interest of the worker that he should strain his labor power as intensely as possible. This in turn enables the capitalist to raise the normal degree of intensity of labor more easily. Moreover, the lengthening of the working day is now in the personal interest of the worker, since with it his daily or weekly wages rise. This gradually brings on a reaction like that already described in time wages, quite apart from the fact that the prolongation of the working day, even if the piece wage remains constant, includes, of necessity, a fall in the price of labor. In time wages, with a few exceptions, the same wage is paid for the same function, while in piece wages, although the price of labor time is measured by a definite quantity of the product, the daily or weekly wage will vary with the individual differences between the workers, one of whom will supply, within a given period, the minimum of product only, another the average, and a third more than the average. With regard to their actual income, then, there is great variety among the individual workers, according to their different degrees of skill, strength, energy, and staying power. Of course, this does not alter the general relation between capital and wage labor. First, the individual differences cancel each other out in the workshop as a whole, which thus supplies the average product within a given period of labor, and the total wages paid will be the average wage of that particular branch of industry. Second, the proportion between wages and surplus value remains unaltered, since the mass of surplus labor supplied by each particular worker corresponds with the wage he receives. But the wider scope that piece wages give to individuality tends to develop both that individuality and with it the worker's sense of liberty, independence, and self-control, and also the competition of workers with each other. The piece wage, therefore, has a tendency, while raising the wages of individuals above the average, to lower this average itself. However, where a particular rate of piece wage has for a long time been a fixed tradition, and its lowering therefore has presented especial difficulties, in such exceptional cases, the masters have sometimes had recourse to the forcible transformation of piece wages into time wages. In 1860, for instance, this action set off a big strike among the ribbon weavers of Coventry. Finally, the piece wage is one of the chief supports of the hour system described in the preceding chapter. From what has been shown so far, it is apparent that the piece wage is the form of wage most appropriate to the capitalist mode of production. Although by no means new, it figures officially side by side with time wages in the French and the English labor statutes of the 14th century. It only conquered a larger field of action during the period of manufacture properly so called. In the stormy youth of large-scale industry, and particularly from 1797 to 1815, it served as a lever for the lengthening of the working day and the lowering of wages. Very important material bearing on the movement of wages during that period is to be found in the two blue books, Report and Evidence from the Select Committee on Petitions Respecting the Corn Laws, the Parliamentary Session of 1813-14, and Report from the Lords Committee on the State of Growth, Commerce, and Consumption of the Grain, and all laws relating thereto, from the session of 1814-15. Here we find documentary evidence of the constant lowering of the price of labor from the beginning of the anti-Jacobin War. In the weaving industry, for example, piece wages had fallen so low that in spite of the very great lengthening of the working day, the daily wage was then lower than it had been before. Quote, "The real earnings of the cotton weaver are now far less than what they were. His superiority over the common laborer, which at first was very great, has now almost entirely ceased. Indeed, the difference in the wages of skillful and common labor is far less now than at any former period." End quote. How little the increased intensity and extension of labor through piece wages benefited the agricultural proletariat can be seen from the following passage from a pamphlet in favor of the landlords and farmers. Quote, By far the greater part of agricultural operations is done by people, who are hired for the day or on piecework. Their weekly wages are about 12 shillings, and although it may be assumed that a man earns on piecework under the greater stimulus to labor 1 shilling or perhaps 2 shillings more than on weekly wages, yet it is found, on calculating his total income, that his loss of employment during the year outweighs this gain. Further, it will generally be found that wages of these men bear a certain proportion to the price of the necessary means of subsistence, so that a man with 2 children is able to bring up his family without recourse to parish relief." End quote. Malthus remarked at that time, with reference to the facts published by Parliament, quote, "I confess that I see, with misgiving, the great extension of the practice of piece wage. Really hard work during 12 or 14 hours of the day, or for any longer time, is too much for any human being." End quote. In those workshops which are subject to the Factory Act, the piece wage becomes the general rule, because there capital can increase the yield of the working day only by intensifying labor. Changes in the productivity of labor mean that the same quantity of a given product represents an amount of labor time which varies. Therefore, the piece wage also varies, for it is the expression of the price of a definite amount of labor time. In our earlier example, 24 pieces were produced in 12 hours, while the value product of the 12 hours was 6 shillings. The daily value of the labor power was 3 shillings, the price of an hour of labor was 3 pence, and the wage for 1 piece was 1.5 pence. Half an hour of labor was absorbed in 1 piece. If the productivity of labor is now doubled, so that the same working day supplies 48 pieces instead of 24, and all other circumstances remain unchanged, then the piece wage falls from 1.5 pence to 3/4 pence, as every piece now only represents 1/4 instead of 1/2 a working hour. 24 times 1.5 pence is equal to 3 shillings, and similarly 48 times 3/4 pence is also equal to 3 shillings. In other words, the piece wage is lowered in the same proportion as the number of pieces produced in the same time rises, and therefore in the same proportion as the amount of labor time employed on the same piece falls. This change in the piece wage, so far purely nominal, leads to constant struggles between the capitalist and the worker, either because the capitalist uses it as a pretext for actually lowering the price of labor, or because an increase in the productivity of labor is accompanied by an increase in its intensity, or because the worker takes the outward appearance of piece wage seriously, i.e., he thinks his product is being paid for and not his labor power, and he therefore resists any reduction of wages which is not accompanied by a reduction in the selling price of the commodity. Quote, "The operatives carefully watch the price of the raw material and the price of manufactured goods, and are thus enabled to form an accurate estimate of their master's profits." End quote. The capitalist rightly rejects such pretensions as being gross errors as to the nature of wage labor. He cries out against this presumptuous attempt to lay taxes on the progress of industry, and declares roundly that the productivity of labor does not concern the worker in the least.